Jacob Mercer is on his knees in frozen dirt when the Halverson boys ride past, stopping their horses to stare at him. It is November of 1893 in the Powder River Basin, and the sky is the color of old tin. Jacob is swinging a pickaxe into ground that has been locked tight. Since the first week of October, the iron rings off the frozen earth, sending a shock up through his wrists and into his shoulders. He is 21 years old. He has $11, and he is digging a hole big enough to swallow a barn dent. Halverson, the older brother, watches from horseback for a full minute before he finally speaks. "Boy," he says finally, "what in the Lord's name are you doing?" Jacob doesn't look up. "Building a barn." The laughter comes both brothers at once, big, rolling bellow laughter that carries across the frozen ground. Dent nearly comes off his horse. Earl slaps his knee. "Underground." Dent says, gasping, he's gonna build an underground barn for his underground cattle. Earl says he's got underground cattle. Dent. Jacob keeps swinging. There is something in him that goes quiet when men laugh at him. He read everything about cold and earth, knowing the ground below the frost line holds 50 degrees. He spent 2 winters doing arithmetic by candlelight in a rented linto room in town. He talked to a Norwegian settler in Sheridan who built earth barns in the old country. He read of the Mandan people who sheltered horses in earth lodges through lethal plains winters. Jacob knows something the Halverson boys don't know. He knows what's coming: a winter that descends every decade, locking the temperature between 50 and 70 below. It buries the hay, kills the cattle, and breaks the ranchers who survive it. Physically surviving it will be measured in architecture. Jacob swings his pickaxe again. The cattle he is trying to protect are not even his. They belong to a man named Orrin Bates. Jacob agreed to winter 32 head in exchange for 30% of the spring calving. He put $211, his life savings, into the lease and materials under tarpaulins. He signed a contract with predatory terms that no cautious man would have accepted. The contract holds Jacob personally liable if the cattle die. He loses every cent of his money. He would return to debt in a land where debt and cold kill young men. His father believed books led to grief, but Jacob knows books are why he is still alive. He swings the pickaxe again. The iron rings off stone. He adjusts his angle and swings again. The hole must be 14 by 60 by 8 feet. After 2 weeks, he has covered barely a third below 4 feet. The earth changes to dark clay loam that smells like something ancient and living. Jacob loads the bucket, signaling his one-eyed mule cotter to lift. The earth cotter stands patient, waiting for the weight, then walks forward. As the earth rises, Jacob's hands have blisters under calluses, and a deep bone itch settles across his weary, layered shoulders. At sunset, the temperature drops 15 degrees. Jacob stares at the excavation. It looks like a long grave. He gets up and starts laying stone. The work of the mason begins in the freezing dark. He spent the summer hauling 6 cords of sandstone and limestone, now waiting under frozen tarpaulins. He lays double walls with a 4-inch air gap, a thermal break where the cold loses its argument. Jacob mixes lime mortar himself using animal fat, an old Norse trick to keep it workable. In the brutal cold, using a plumb bob on a string, he ensures the walls remain straight and true against the winter's weight. On December 4th, the north wall fails. A low grinding precedes the collapse of 400 pounds of sandstone. Standing at the excavation's edge, Jacob stares at the gap left by 12 carefully laid stones. The mortar failed to cure in the extreme cold. The frost entered before the mixture could fully set, with limited stone remaining. He faces a sleepless night, realizing he cannot afford a single mistake. Jacob relays the section, carefully mixing small mortar batches and keeping them close to a small fire to prevent freezing. He tests every course by pressing his palm flat against the stone, looking for any flex or give. By the 8th of December, the walls are complete. However, the jordkjeller still lacks its protective roof. On December 9th, old Sims rides over, watching the excavation from a careful distance on horseback. Sims watches Jacob work the plumb bob in silence, his expression showing a quiet, mounting curiosity. Double wall. Sims finally says, "Yes, sir." Jacob replies, never breaking his rhythm. Jacob explains the thermal break, how cold conducts through stone, but fails against a void. Sims stares at the walls and asks Jacob where he learned such an unusual construction. Jacob explains the earth barns of the old country called jordkjeller, which have held temperature for 4 centuries. Sims recounts how his father lost 400 head of cattle, and 2 fingers in the winter of 6 to 7 recognizing Jacob's vision Sims. Offers old timber ridge poles that fit the barn's 14-foot span perfectly. Jacob pauses his work looking up at the old man. I'd be grateful, he says, his voice quiet. 3 days later, Sims hired. Hand delivers 7 massive pine beams on a heavy wooden wagon. Jacob unloads the timber alone, running his hand along the grain of the wood that will ensure survival. The roof has frightened him most in his candlelight arithmetic. He needs a span without center posts for moving animals. Jacob notches the beams to sit in the stone corbels. He covers the beams with saplings, and packed clay he mounds 2 feet of excavated soil over the top. Seeded grass will root and anchor the living roof. Packed earth is a superior insulator, slow to change temperature. This roof's insulating value exceeds any timber frame barn in Wyoming. 8 feet deep, the earth holds 50 degrees year. On the worst blizzard cannot touch what is underground. The structure sits inside the earth's heat, the planet's warmth. Rising through clay and stone, patient and reliable, he adds 2 diagonal ventilation shafts to mix incoming cold air with rising warmth before it reaches the floor. Jacob caps each shaft with perforated clay pots traded for his last good rope at a nearby farmstead. The farmwife tells everyone of the transaction, further damaging Jacob's reputation among the local ranchers. The entrance is a stone and timber vestibule 8 feet long, acting as a thermal airlock. For the cattle, doors of cottonwood planks are stuffed with hay, providing thermal resistance to bridge the transition. Dent Halverson mocks the badger build as he rides past, and Earl nearly falls from his horse laughing. Jacob hangs the second door and stands in the dark interior, breathing the scent of new clay and earth. Holding his borrowed thermometer, he sees it reading 43 degrees despite having no animals inside. Yet he allows himself one moment of quiet satisfaction before leaving to bring the 32 head of cattle inside. On December 12th, Jacob uses oats to coax the lead cow Beulah through the entrance tunnel. He closes the inner door, surrounded by 32 animals. In a space of profound, earthy silence, the interior is 4 to 4 degrees, 58 degrees warmer than the frozen world outside. Jacob records the numbers in his notebook, knowing the true test of winter is yet to come. For 3 weeks, December brings ordinary Wyoming cold, manageable for conventional timber frame barns. The Halverson and Sims cattle are sheltered, their insurance unproven. As drama remains absent, Hannah Broward tells customers that Jacob's underground barn is an abomination against nature. She claims the cattle will sicken from lack of sunlight and nursing on borrowed money. Jacob checks his herd twice daily, recording the interior temperature in his small, worn notebook. While the exterior hits 40 below, the interior remains a stable and life-saving 38 degrees. Cattle need 20 degrees to survive. Jacob records the margins. December is not the test. Jacob runs 18 degrees of margin. The cattle eat hay steadily, generating warmth from shelter, not food. On the verge of hope, Jacob watches his hay supply last and his $11 stretch. January 8, 1894. The temperature rises deceptively. The sky turns the color of old pewter. Jacob spends the day laying in extra hay and checking every seal. On the entrance doors, he plugs a clay gap in the roof and adjusts the ventilation pots for optimal air mixing. In his rented room, Jacob lies on his narrow bed, listening to the unnatural silence outside. At 2 in the morning, the silence ends. The violent blizzard begins its assault. Jacob hears the storm's freight train roar. The window flexes inward as the first violent gust hits the house. Within 40 minutes, the temperature plummets 20 degrees. The biting cold begins to permeate the thin wooden walls. By dawn, the thermometer reads 4 to 3 below zero. A white annihilation has completely erased the Wyoming landscape. Winds gusting to 7 to 2 miles per hour blow snow sideways, creating a formless roar that swallows all visibility. Jacob layers himself in everything he owns, wrapping a wool scarf 3 times around his face for protection. Stepping out into the whiteout, the wind nearly knocks him sideways. He plants his feet and begins to walk. Jacob counts his steps in the blinding whiteout. 112 paces to the barn entrance, moving through an intelligent wind. His breath freezes against his lips. By 30 steps, his fingertips go numb inside his wool-lined leather gloves. At 60 steps, the world is an erased void. Jacob walks by pure count and an absolute refusal to stop on step 109. He nearly falls into the tunnel, grabbing the door frame as silence suddenly descends, standing in the vestibule. The ice on his lips begins to thaw. He reaches out and opens the inner door. The cattle are calm. All 32 stand and lie in their ordinary patterns, sheltered from the storm. Beulah chews slowly, content. The air smells of hay, animal warmth, and the dark earth clay walls. Jacob pulls off his glove and reaches for his thermometer to verify the success of his architecture. 42 degrees inside, 43 below zero. Outside, an 8 degree difference in the worst hours of the decade. He stands with the thermometer in his bare hand as the cattle breathe around him, calculating the victory for 3 hours. He checks every animal individually, watching their rhythmic breathing in the warm, stable air. He checks the clay-sealed water troughs sunk into the floor. The water has not frozen. The absence of fear confirms his success. Frightened cattle make noise. These animals are comfortable and quiet. Jacob battles the white annihilation twice more, counting 112 paces through wind that wants to take him sideways. At dusk, the exterior hits 47 below inside the earth. The temperature holds steady at a life-saving 41 degrees. The extra hay remains untouched. The cattle generate warmth from the earth, not from frantic caloric consumption of food elsewhere. The Halverson barn fights for its life. The Borden batten siding shudders under the blizzard's relentless assault. Timber frames contract and nails back out as the wood shrinks away, allowing the wind to enlarge every gap. By the second day, the Halverson barn's interior temperature plummets to a lethal 11 degrees below zero. The cattle huddle in a corner, too cold and frightened to reach the hay across the barn. Earl Halverson spends the second night in the barn, wrapped in blankets, clutching a burning lantern. The wind invades the barn, making the boards feel as if they might simply stop existing and dissolve. The animals tremble with a full-body vibration, their final argument against the lethal, overwhelming cold. When the storm breaks on January 12th, the Halversons find 6 animals lost to the cold dent, and Earl stand in silent grief over the animals they fed and worked beside all fall. Old Sims loses 4 cattle and his granary roof, taking the loss with the quiet resignation of a man used to hard truths. The hardware store stands open like a face with no features, its false front torn away by the wind. Jacob steps into a crystalline, rearranged world. The sky is a ceramic blue, clear and cold. Jacob reaches the barn and spends an hour digging out the tunnel entrance, his labor warming his frozen limbs. He uncovers the cottonwood door, clears the vestibule, and finally reaches for the inner door's latch. 39 degrees. It has dropped 3 degrees over 3 days of the worst storm he has ever witnessed. Every animal is standing, all 32. Beulah pushes her forehead against his chest in a familiar gesture. The roof is invisible under 4 feet of snow, looking like a natural long, low ridge in the landscape. Dent Halverson arrives on January 14th, his face complicated as his lifelong certainties begin to crack. How many you lose? Dent asks. Jacob replies with a single calm word. None. Dent asks of the temperature. Jacob confirms it was 39 this morning. 42 at the storm's height. Dent looks at the mounded earth roof, barely visible above the snow line, and the double-walled stone. He sees the ventilation pots and the arithmetic of 8 and 9 degrees of difference. I lost 6, Dent says, struggling to accept the loss of the cattle Earl sat with. By God, Dent whispers, finally acknowledging the forgotten knowledge of the Mandan and Norse. Dent asks if Jacob can draw it out for him, hoping to save 30 more cattle. I'll draw it and help you lay the first course, Jacob says. Dent nods and leaves Old Sims and his hired hand spent an afternoon inside the earth barn learning Jacob's engineering. Jacob explains the diagonal vents, clay-sealed water troughs, and hay-insulated vestibule doors to the ranchers standing in the tunnel. Sims admits his father might have saved his herd if he'd listened. Sims notes his father refused to learn from those he deemed unworthy of his attention. Jacob reflects on those words through February's cold and the grudging thaw of March spring. Calving arrives, granting Jacob his 30% share and a start toward something real. The barn is an answer. The question is what we refuse to learn. Because of pride, the Mandan wintered horses for generations. A Norwegian farmer carried building knowledge across an ocean. Wisdom sat within reach of every rancher, yet was ignored. Because of those who held it, Jacob was willing to look testing logic against Problems reading across categories fixed by others, he was willing to be wrong relaying the cold north wall mortar. Without any complaint, the cold is honest. Bad ideas are proven within hours at 50 degrees below zero. The cold tests walls, mortar, and ventilation shafts. With total indifference to intentions or reputation, the earth won the argument it holds. 50 degrees 8 feet, down regardless of the effort. Jacob simply built stone walls and a clay roof, letting the earth perform its ancient duty. You stand before a problem everyone believes can only be solved in the way it always has, an idea making no sense to anyone looking at it from inside their own certainty. Laughter at the fence line builds like a blizzard's snowfall, pressure settling over your resolve. The earth beneath your feet is older than assumptions and warmer than your doubt. It holds things safely through nameless storms, and cold so complete it makes yours feel mild. It works without effort or opinion, indifferent to whether you believe it or not. The pickaxe rings. The mule stands patient, and the neighbors have finally begun to look.